Assalamu alaikum everyone. I'm Nadia Tasleem and I'm here via Enablers with an analysis of the issue that has grabbed the world's attention today. That of course is none other than Russian war against Ukraine. Wars do have a toll on humanity that lasts for long, and this war is also going to have strong implications, not only on the lives of the people of Ukraine, but also on the lives of Europeans and the people living in different parts of the world, primarily because it's not only going to kill people, but is also going to crash the economies. If you see the map, you can easily see how these Russians, they have intervened in Ukrainian regions, they've crossed the border, and the fight is going on between the Ukrainian troops being led by their own president, Zelensky, and the Russian troops. Russians have claimed to occupy Kharkiv, and they are fighting against Ukrainians in the capital city of Ukraine, Kyiv, and Mariupol. At the same time, these Ukrainians, they have leashed Russia for their next target to be Odessa, which is the coastal region of Ukraine. So the fight is obviously going to have strong implications. Now, if we just look at this kind of war, of course, the question hop in our mind that why Putin intervened in this region, why out of nowhere he just crossed the border, sent his troops and started fighting, despite the fact that he himself has to face serious consequences means obviously starting from the kind of sanctions that they have to face and then many others to come. But of course, this war has a background. There were some imperatives that led Putin to intervene in Ukraine. However, we can't justify his intervention on any pretext, primarily because the war in either case shouldn't be considered as an option, primarily because the loss is of the civilians, innocent people in the wars. So if we just look at the background, we see that Ukraine, which is facing now the Russian forces, once used to be part of the Soviet Empire. At the time of end of Cold War, Ukraine also wanted to gain independence. We know that Soviet Union ultimately got disintegrated and 15 independent states came out of the Soviet Union. So one of them was Ukraine, though Soviet Union did not want Ukraine to get independent or to get separated from the Soviet Union. So Ukraine, they launched their struggle for independence, and even the communist factions of Ukraine supported this idea, and ultimately Ukraine was able to announce its independence back in 1991. From then onwards, they didn't have much comfortable relations with Russia, and on and off, they used to have different kind of tensions. However, the most challenging thing for Ukraine was to deal with its own demographic composition, to deal with its own ethnic groups. Ukraine has got an interesting demographic profile. A country with a population of 43.7 million has 77.8% Ukrainians, however, 17.3% Russians. And these 17.3%, they are consolidated in some of the regions of Ukraine, which further strengthens them. Besides that, there are 5% other people belonging to other ethnic identities. If you just see at this ethno-linguistic map of Ukraine, you see that the Ukrainians reside in the red regions, however, Russians reside in all these yellow, pale, brown, yellow with brown lines, these regions. And here they are consolidated, hence stand to be a strong force, which proves to be further challenging for the Ukrainians. Now, if we just look at the ethnic composition of the groups where Ukrainians face the grave challenges or have been facing grave challenges, particularly since 2014, those regions include Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk. These Luhansk and Donetsk, combinedly known as Donbas region, which is also bordering Russians and are on the eastern side. However, Crimea, which is in the southern side, had the Russian majority, which was 65.3%, as opposed to just 15.1% Ukrainian. So they launched their struggle and were able to gain independence back in 2014, which further tore Russian and Ukrainian relations apart, because Russia not only recognized them to be an independent region, rather annex them with Russia. And now Russians, they want international community and Ukraine itself to recognize Russian sovereignty over Crimea. At the same time, separatists, they launched their own independence movement in this Donbas region, in these two, particularly in these two republics of Donbas region. And that movement ultimately turned to be one of the key factors behind this recent war between Russia and Ukraine. Because both in Luhansk and Donetsk, we see that more than 38% Russians reside. Now, if we go the way I just mentioned, the year 2014, when tensions were at the peak, we see the international community got involved and brought these countries on negotiating tables, and they somehow were able to sign agreements that were collectively termed as Minsk Agreements 1 and 2. Both of these agreements were actually to resolve the tension between the two sides. Minsk Agreement 1, though proved to be futile, it was signed in 2014, came up with the provisions like prisoner exchanges, deliveries of humanitarian aid, withdrawal of heavy weapons, primarily because Russians were alleged to support the separatists of Donbas regions. However, both sides, they somehow violated and did not abide by the Minsk 1 agreement. Then in 2015, finally, a 13-point agreement in which even the leadership of Donetsk and Luhansk was also included. They came up with this Minsk 2 agreement. And this agreement, it of course recognized the Ukrainian border. However, it asked Ukraine to establish an interim self-government in Donetsk and Luhansk region. Besides that, elections were also supposed to be held over there, and Ukraine was supposed to introduce the policies of decentralization. Ceasefire, of course, was one of the key clauses. The interesting thing is that even Minsk 2 now doesn't seem to be really successful, primarily because Russians and Ukrainians, they interpreted this agreement as per their own likeness or as per their own convenience. And so that also now, by now when the war began, we don't see Minsk agreement to be incorporated in the bilateral affairs between Ukraine and Russia. Another important thing which proved to be a point of concern for Russians was actually the rise of Zelensky into power, who turned to be the Ukrainian president in April 2019. He was someone who was anti-status quo in Ukraine. And once he got hold of power, he decided to end the separatist movement in Donbas region and also started putting efforts to bring Ukraine into the NATO. He wanted NATO to grant membership to Ukraine. This was something which Russians could not accept. Now, coming to this particular point, because this is the point which now aggravated Russian reaction and led Russia to intervene in Ukraine, primarily because if we just try to recall the psyche that Russians had back at the time of Cold War period, we see that Russians, they had been the victim of paranoia historically, and they did not want the Western countries or the capitalist bloc to reside closer to the Russian borders. That is why they asked for a string of pearls back during the Cold War period. Now, what is going on in the closed-door neighbors of Russia is that NATO has extended its bases to the countries like, you see, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. These are the bordering regions of Russia. And if now, and Belarus somehow happens to be the ally of Russia. However, if NATO troops get entered into Ukraine, Russian insecurity will enhance. And this is what Putin claims. So the presence of NATO, heavy presence of NATO in the nearby regions, and the likelihood of NATO's extension to Ukraine, again, turned to be one of the key points which led Russia to intervene in Ukraine. Means obviously the war was not decided overnight. Putin came up with a set of demands prior to this war, and probably the Western countries, they didn't come up with the kind of reaction they were supposed to show. So he came up with the list of demands back in December 2021, and there were 8 demands that were focusing on some of the key issues related to Russian security, because they wanted security guarantees, and they also wanted assurance of the fact that Ukraine will never be included into the NATO, primarily because President Bush back in 1990, Senior Bush, he had agreed with Gorbachev and then with Boris Yeltsin that he won't include Ukraine in NATO or won't extend NATO over there. Though there's no legal written agreement about this particular clause, however, Russians have been emphasizing on the fact that there was a tacit agreement between the two sides. Now, when Putin came up with these demands, Westerns, they considered them to be aggressive demands and refused to accept any of the demands being posed by Russia. So, because of this, means obviously Russians ultimately came up with this decision to start war. And on 24th February, the war began, which has led to hundreds of soldiers and civilians killings, and many others have obviously got injured. And more than 1.5 million have fled their country, and they have been trying to get refuge in different parts of the world. Now, amidst this war, of course, talks have been carried. Two rounds of talks have already been carried. First round was not considered to be really significant, or it didn't come up with much fruitful results, primarily because Russian President Putin has been demanding that Crimea should be considered as, or should be recognized as, part of Russia, and the issue of NATO's extension to Ukraine should immediately be resolved. However, in the second round of talks, they decided to provide a kind of partial truce and ceasefire in order to give evacuation to the people on humanitarian grounds. A kind of humanitarian corridor had to be introduced. However, and for that matter, Russians on Saturday, 5th March, they actually announced to provide that humanitarian corridor. However, Ukraine has alleged Russia for not fulfilling its own announcement, or for not abiding by its own announcement, and for somehow violating its own its own commitment, and for shelling the people, which has obviously increased the number of casualties. Now, third round of talk is set to be on 8th of March, on 7th of March, and the world is obviously looking forward to it. So this is all about the background of the Ukrainian and Russian war and Ukrainian crisis. Talks are going on, and things can ultimately get resolved. However, as per Mahmoud Darwish saying, the war will end, the leaders will shake hands. The old women will keep waiting for her martyred son. That girl will wait for her beloved husband. And those children will wait for their heroic father. I don't know who sold our homeland, but I saw who paid the price. And this is the kind of price in every war, innocent civilians actually have to pay. So now we have to discuss, because this episode of Ukrainian crisis has a lot of things to be explored. So we have to look into the world's response to Ukrainian crisis, both in terms of the kind of protests that are being held, the kind of response that the world has shown at the UN forum, or even otherwise, and the kind of duality that we see in the Western attitude in context of Ukraine and in context of many of the crises into which the world has been. For all that, you have to stay tuned to us, and you have to wait for our next episode to get the answer. Thank you so much for your patience. Stay blessed. Allah Hafiz.